Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it means the world to us. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It creates this amazing global community of night owls and mystery seekers. Now let's get into something truly unsettling. Tonight's story isn't about ghosts. It isn't about demons or ancient curses. It's about something far more disturbing. The moment when reality itself forgets you exist. When the simulation glitches and you're left standing in the error message. This is the story of a cabin that should never have been rented, a vacation that bent the rules of existence, and one person's terrifying discovery that the world we live in might not be as solid as we think. This is the documented account of what happens when you accidentally step outside the boundaries of reality itself. The cabin that forgot I existed. Chapter 1. The break I should have never taken. My name is Alex Morrison, and for 7 years I worked as a software engineer in Seattle. 80-hour weeks, constant deadlines, screens burning into my retinas until 3 in the morning. My life had become a blur of code, coffee, and the perpetual blue light of monitors. I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix anymore, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes you forget what rest even feels like. So when my project finally shipped in late March, I did something I hadn't done since college. I took time off, real time off. Not a long weekend where I'd check emails every 30 minutes. Not a vacation where my laptop came with me, just in case. I'm talking about a complete disconnection. 2 weeks in the middle of nowhere, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no way for the world to reach me. I found the cabin listing on an obscure rental site, one of those platforms that specialises in truly remote properties. The kind of places that don't have Ring doorbells or smart thermostats. The cabin was located deep in the Cascade Mountains, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forests for miles. The listing described it as primitive but comfortable, with total privacy guaranteed. The photo showed a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by towering evergreens, an absolute wilderness. Perfect. I paid the deposit, packed a duffel bag with clothes and a few paperback books, and drove out on a Sunday morning in early April. The drive itself was therapeutic, watching the city fall away in my rearview mirror, replaced gradually by smaller towns, then country roads, then nothing but forest. My phone lost signal about 40 minutes before I reached the turnoff. The GPS had stopped updating miles back, but the printed directions the owner had emailed worked fine. The dirt road to the cabin was rougher than I expected. My sedan bounced over ruts and rocks, branches scraping the sides. I drove slowly, carefully, wondering if I'd made a mistake renting a place this isolated. But then the trees opened up into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Rustic cedar walls, weathered to a soft grey. A pitched roof with dark shingles, 2 small windows flanking a heavy wooden door. A stone chimney rose from one side. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, complete with an old rocking chair that had seen better days. Firewood was stacked neatly under an overhang. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out into the mountain air. The silence hit me first. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm day, not the gentle hush of a library, or the muffled stillness of snowfall. This was different. This was the kind of silence that felt like the world had inhaled deeply and then held its breath, waiting for something. I stood there for a moment, keys dangling from my hand, listening to absolutely nothing. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. The trees around the clearing were perfectly still, as if they'd been frozen mid-sway. Even the wind seemed to have paused. Just tired, I muttered to myself. You're just not used to actual quiet. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The interior was simple but clean. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A wood stove sat in the corner, its black pipe disappearing into the ceiling. Mismatched furniture, a sagging couch, a wooden table with 3 chairs, a rocking chair near the stove, gave the place a cobbled-together charm. 2 doors led off the main room, one to a tiny bathroom with a toilet and sink, the other to a small bedroom with a double bed covered in a faded quilt. Everything smelled like pine and dust and old wood. Not unpleasant, just old, settled, like the cabin had been waiting empty for a very long time. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking clothes, investigating the kitchen cabinets, well stocked with canned goods and dried pasta, and getting a fire going in the wood stove. The owner had left basic instructions on a laminated card: how to prime the water pump, where the breaker box was located, how to light the propane stove. Everything worked as promised. As evening fell, I made a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, then sat on the porch with one of my books. The forest was growing dark, the trees becoming black silhouettes against a deepening purple sky. Still no sound. No owls hooting, no distant coyotes, no small animals scurrying through underbrush. Just that held-breath silence. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting up to the tree line, searching for movement that never came. Eventually, I gave up and went inside. The cabin felt warmer with the fire going, more welcoming. I locked the door, though who knows what I thought I was locking out in the middle of nowhere, and went to bed early. That first night, I slept hard. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes from exhaustion finally catching up. But I woke suddenly in the darkness, heart pounding, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, tapped the screen to check the time. 3:11 in the morning. The room was pitch black except for that glowing screen. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I realised it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the absence of sound. Not just silence, not just quiet. It was like someone had pressed pause on existence itself. I couldn't hear my own breathing, couldn't hear the creak of the bed frame when I shifted position, couldn't hear the whisper of the quilt against my skin. The world had stopped making noise entirely. I held my breath, though I couldn't hear myself doing it, and counted to 10. Then I exhaled slowly and listened again. Nothing. Absolute nothing. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, sound returned. The gentle tick of cooling wood in the stove, the faint whistle of wind through the chimney, the soft rustle of fabric as I moved. Everything was normal again. I lay there for another 20 minutes, heart gradually slowing, telling myself it was just the strangeness of a new place. Your ears playing tricks in unfamiliar surroundings. Everyone knows that silence can seem louder than noise when you're not used to it. Eventually, I fell back asleep, but something in the cabin had changed. I couldn't name it yet, couldn't point to anything specific, but the feeling was there, subtle and persistent, like a word on the tip of your tongue or a presence just outside your peripheral vision. The cabin had noticed me, and now it was watching. Chapter 2. The First Ripples. I woke to pale morning light filtering through the bedroom curtains. For a moment, I just lay there, warm and comfortable, almost forgetting the strange moment of absolute silence from the night before. Almost. I got up, padded into the kitchen, and started making coffee using the old percolator on the propane stove. While the water heated, I opened the front door to let in some fresh air. The morning was cool and bright. Sunlight slanted through the pine trees, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with brown needles. The air smelled crisp and clean, tinged with that particular mountain freshness that makes your lungs feel new. I stood on the porch, coffee mug warming my hands, and watched a small bird, maybe a junco or chickadee, hopping along a low branch about 20 feet away. It pecked at the bark, hopped forward, pecked again. Then it hopped backward. Not turned around and hopped, not flew and landed in a different spot. It literally hopped backward, as if someone had hit rewind on a video. 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops backward along the branch, returning to its starting position. Then it continued forward again, pecking the same spots it had just pecked. I blinked, shook my head slightly, and took a sip of coffee. The bird flew away, disappearing into the canopy. "Need more sleep," I muttered. I went back inside and made a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal. While eating, I noticed something odd about the light coming through the kitchen window. A single leaf was drifting past the glass, falling from one of the tall pines. Except it wasn't falling downward, it was falling upward. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched. The leaf rose slowly, spinning gently, ascending past the window frame. It rose about 6 feet, then snapped back down like a reversed film clip, returning to its starting position below the window. Then it began rising again, following the exact same path. I pressed my face to the glass, watching this impossible loop repeat 3 times before the leaf finally detached from whatever invisible track it was following and fell normally to the ground. My hands were shaking slightly as I rinsed my bowl in the sink. The bathroom mirror was old and spotted with age, the silver backing degraded around the edges. I went in to brush my teeth, and that's when I noticed the lag. I raised my right hand to my face. My reflection raised its hand. A split second later, not much, maybe half a second, but definitely delayed. I waved my hand back and forth quickly, and the reflection followed just a beat behind, like a video call with bad latency. I stopped moving and stared at myself. My reflection stared back, expression for expression. Then I saw my reflection blink, and felt myself blink a moment after. My reflection had blinked first. I stumbled out of the bathroom, heart hammering. This was getting too weird, too consistent, too specific. I was either having some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination, or something was genuinely wrong with this place. I needed to clear my head. A walk in the forest, fresh air, distance from the cabin. I pulled on my hiking boots, grabbed a water bottle, and headed out. The cabin had a small trail leading from the clearing into the woods. Just a narrow path through the pines, marked occasionally by stacks of rocks. The owner had mentioned it in his instructions. Trail loops around the property, about 2 miles total. Easy hiking. I set off at a brisk pace, trying to focus on the physical sensations of walking, breathing, moving. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Shafts of sun pierced the canopy, illuminating floating dust motes. The pine needle carpet muffled my footsteps. Still no bird sounds, I noticed, no insects. But I pushed the observation aside. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, following the trail as it curved and wound between massive tree trunks. I started to relax, to feel silly about my earlier panic. Of course the bird's movement had been my tired eyes. Of course the leaf had been caught in an eddy of wind. Of course the mirror lag was just the result of an old, warped reflective surface. Then I rounded a bend and stopped dead. There, directly in front of me, on the trail, was a clear boot print, in a patch of exposed dirt. My boot print. I looked down at my feet, then at the print. Same tread pattern, same size, fresh. I looked back the way I'd come. The trail behind me curved away into the trees. I'd been walking in a straightish line for 20 minutes, never doubling back. But this was definitely my print. And it hadn't been here before, because I was the one who just made it. Except I was standing 2 feet away from it. I looked ahead on the trail. There was another print, and another, leading away in the direction I'd been walking. My prints, all of them, as if I'd already walked this section of trail. My mouth went dry. I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin, moving faster now, no longer pretending to be calm. The trees seemed closer together. The trail seemed narrower. I walked for what felt like 10 minutes, breathing hard, telling myself I'd see the cabin clearing any moment. I rounded a familiar-looking bend and stopped. There, on the trail in front of me, was the same boot print. The same patch of exposed dirt. The same everything. I'd walked in a complete circle, but the trail had never curved back on itself. I'd been walking in what felt like a straight line, and somehow I'd ended up back where I started. I ran. Actually ran, crashing through underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely, heading in what I was certain was a straight line, back toward the cabin. Branches whipped my face, my boots slipped on loose pine needles, my breath came in ragged gasps. And then suddenly, the trees opened up, and I stumbled into the clearing, the cabin sitting there exactly as I'd left it, the rocking chair still swaying slightly on the porch from the breeze of the door closing behind me when I'd left. I bent over, hands on knees, gulping air. The cabin looked normal, peaceful, exactly as a cabin in the woods should look. But I knew, absolutely knew, that something was very, very wrong with this place. Chapter 3. The cabin repeatsy. I spent the rest of the morning inside, door locked, trying to rationalise what had happened. I made more coffee. I attempted to read. I stared at the ceiling, counting knots in the wooden boards. Every rational part of my brain insisted there were logical explanations. I was exhausted, disoriented. The lack of familiar reference points in a forest, all trees looked the same, had confused my sense of direction. But the bird hopping backward, the leaf falling upward, my reflections delay, my own boot prints ahead of me, on a trail I hadn't walked yet. These weren't subtle misperceptions. These were violations of basic physics. I was pouring my fourth cup of coffee when I noticed the mug. It was sitting on the counter, exactly where I'd left it after breakfast. Except I was certain, absolutely certain, I'd placed it next to the sink, not near the stove. I stood there, coffee pot in hand, staring at the mug's position. Had I moved it without thinking? Was I misremembering? I set the pot down and took a photo of the mug with my phone, just to have a record. Then I deliberately moved the mug to the far end of the counter, near the window, and took another photo. I went into the bedroom to grab a book. When I came back 90 seconds later, the mug was next to the stove again. I checked my phone. The photos were still there. First photo showing the mug near the sink, second photo showing it by the window. But the actual mug had moved back to a position that wasn't in either photo. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I looked at the clock on the wall, an old analogue thing with a white face and black hands. It read 10:47. I watched the second hand tick around the face. Normal, steady, tick, tick, tick. Then it stopped. The second hand froze in place, pointing at the 6. I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got to 30. The second hand hadn't moved. Then suddenly it jumped. Not smoothly catching up, but a single large jump forward. The clock now read 11:47. I'd lost an hour, or gained an hour, or time had just decided to skip forward by exactly 60 minutes. I grabbed my phone to check the time there. It showed 10:48, matching what the clock should have read. But the date was wrong. February 29th. This year wasn't a leap year. I knew that for certain. This year was divisible by 4, yes, but not by 100, or... Wait, no. How do leap years work? I tried to remember the rule, but my brain felt fuzzy, like trying to think through mud. I checked the calendar app. It insisted today was February 29th, even though that was months ago, and even though this year shouldn't have had a February 29th anyway. I needed to rest, needed to clear my head. I was obviously more exhausted than I'd thought. Maybe I was actually getting sick, a fever scrambling my perceptions, making me hallucinate or misremember things. I went into the bedroom, lay down on the quilt, and closed my eyes. Sleep came surprisingly fast. I woke with late afternoon light, slanting through the window. The quality of the light was different, softer, more golden. I must have slept for hours. I felt groggy and disoriented. That particular confusion that comes from napping too long during the day. I sat up and immediately noticed something wrong. The bedroom was different. Not dramatically different. Not transformed. Just slightly off. The position of the furniture had changed. The bed I was lying on was now against a different wall. The small dresser had moved to the opposite corner. The window, which I was certain had been on my left when I'd lain down, was now on my right. I stood up slowly, heart pounding. I walked into the main room. The couch had shifted. The rocking chair by the stove was now on the other side of the stove. The kitchen table was rotated 90 degrees. The rug that had been in front of the door was now in front of the stove. Someone had rearranged the entire cabin while I slept, except no one had been here. The door was still locked from the inside, chains still in place. The windows were shut and latched. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dust, no indication that anyone had been here at all. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and found the photos I'd taken yesterday. Casual shots of the cabin interior when I'd first arrived, just documenting the place. I swiped through them, comparing them to the current layout. The photos showed the furniture in the current positions. Not the positions I remembered from yesterday, the current positions. As if the cabin had always been arranged this way, and my memory of the different layout was the error. But I had clear, vivid memories of the couch being on the other wall, of the rocking chair being in a different spot, of going to sleep with the window on my left. I checked the lamp near the couch, a brass thing with a stained glass shade. I remembered it being unplugged yesterday, the cord coiled neatly at its base. Now it was plugged in and turned on, casting warm coloured light across the room. Had it been on when I woke up? I couldn't remember, but I definitely, absolutely remembered it being unplugged before. I sat down on the couch, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think clearly. The cabin was changing, not just objects moving. The whole layout was shifting, rearranging itself like a living space that couldn't decide on its own floor plan. And my photos were changing with it, retroactively matching the new configuration. Like reality itself was being edited, and I was the only one who remembered the previous draft. I stood up and went to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was lower in the sky, just starting to touch the tops of the tallest pines. The shadows were long and dark across the clearing, and there, at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, was a figure, a person, standing perfectly still, watching the cabin, watching me. Chapter 4. The Stranger Who Isn't. The figure was too far away to make out details, just a dark silhouette against the darker trees, human-shaped, motionless. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, couldn't see a face or clothing, just the outline of a person standing at the edge of the forest. My first reaction was relief. Another person. Someone else in this isolated place. Maybe they were lost, or maybe they were staying at a neighbouring cabin I didn't know about. I raised my hand and waved. "Hello." The figure raised its hand and waved back, but not immediately. There was a delay. A 1-second gap between my wave and the figure's response. Like the lag in my reflection that morning, but worse, more obvious. I lowered my hand slowly. The figure lowered its hand a second later. I took a step forward off the porch. The figure took a step forward. A second later, my stomach dropped. The posture, the build, the way the figure stood. It was familiar. It was me. I was looking at myself. I stumbled backward, and the figure stumbled backward a second later. Perfect synchronization with that 1-second delay. I turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, throwing the lock and sliding the chain into place. I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard, trying to think. That wasn't possible. That wasn't real. I was hallucinating, I had to be. Carbon monoxide from the wood stove, some kind of gas leak, dehydration, a psychotic break brought on by stress. I grabbed a glass and filled it from the tap, chugged the water, filled it again. I was not crazy, I was not hallucinating. I was tired and stressed, and this cabin was old and isolated, and my mind was playing tricks on me because of the unfamiliar environment. I repeated this to myself like a mantra while I paced the main room, avoiding the windows, avoiding looking outside. As evening fell, I forced myself to eat something. A can of beans heated on the stove, some crackers. The cabin grew dark around me. I lit the propane lantern rather than using the electric lights. The warm glow felt safer somehow, more grounding, more real. I tried to focus on a book, but the words swam on the page. Every creak of the cabin settling made me flinch. Every whisper of wind outside sounded like footsteps. Around 9 o'clock, according to the wall clock, which may or may not have been accurate, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the porch, slow deliberate footsteps, the wooden boards creaking under weight, coming from the left side of the cabin, moving toward the front door. I set down my book, moving as quietly as I could, and grabbed the fireplace poker, the only thing resembling a weapon in the cabin. I stood in the centre of the main room, poker raised, listening. The footsteps reached the door. Stopped. Silence. Then a soft sound, almost like breathing but muffled, coming from just outside the door. I waited, every muscle tense, ready to fight or run or scream. Nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door, back along the porch, fading around the side of the cabin. I waited another 5 minutes, then crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. The porch was empty. The clearing was dark, just vague shapes of trees against a slightly lighter sky. No figure, no person, no movement. But I could see footprints in the dirt at the edge of the porch. Fresh prints. The same tread pattern as my hiking. Boots. The same size, my own footprints. Coming up to the door and then walking away. But I hadn't been outside. I'd been inside the cabin listening to those footsteps. Listening to something that wore my boots walking across my porch. I backed away from the window and sat on the couch, poker still clutched in my hands. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. I just sat there, watching the shadows, listening to the cabin settle and creak around me, waiting for morning. Chapter 5. Time folds inward. Morning came eventually, though I wasn't sure I could trust it. The light filtering through the windows had that early dawn quality, soft, grey, tentative. I'd been sitting on the couch for hours, dozing fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the day brighten. The forest looked normal, peaceful, like yesterday's events had never happened. I almost convinced myself to leave, pack my things, get in the car, drive back to civilization, and forget this whole nightmare. But something kept me there. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the part of me that was a software engineer, that wanted to understand the bug before abandoning the system. Maybe just the exhaustion of knowing I'd have to explain why I'd left early, and having no explanation that wouldn't sound insane. I decided to approach this scientifically. Document everything. Look for patterns. Treat it like debugging code. The first thing I noticed, it was 9:47 in the morning, according to the wall clock. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my phone, ready to take notes. At exactly 9:47, a bird tapped the window. Not flew into it, not pecked at something on the glass. It tapped it. 3 precise taps, evenly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. I looked up. There was no bird at the window. The window was empty, but I definitely heard the tapping, clear and distinct. I made a note in my phone. 9:47. 3 taps. No visible source. I decided to stay at the table and see what else happened. The day proceeded in an increasingly surreal fashion. Around 11 o'clock, I realised I couldn't hear any sound from outside. I went to the window and looked out at the forest. Trees stood perfectly still. Not a single branch moving. Not a leaf trembling. The whole forest had frozen like a paused video. I watched for 10 minutes. Nothing moved. Then all at once, motion returned. Branches swaying, leaves fluttering, as if someone had pressed play again. At exactly 9:47 that evening, I checked the clock repeatedly, waiting. The 3 taps came again. Tap, tap, tap. No bird visible. The next morning, same thing. 9:47, 3 taps. No bird. It was a recording. The cabin was playing back the same moment, over and over, at the exact same time. Like a glitch in a video game, where certain scripted events trigger on schedule regardless of the player's actions. I started testing other things. I'd speak out loud and listen to the echo in the cabin. Normal houses have a certain acoustic quality. Sound bounces off walls, gets absorbed by furniture, creates a particular audio signature, but the cabin's acoustics were wrong. My voice echoed too long, too hollow, as if the walls weren't solid wood, but thin facades over a much larger empty space. I tried the food test next. I opened a can of soup, ate half of it, left the rest in the pot on the stove, went for a walk around the clearing, staying close to the cabin, not venturing into the forest. When I came back inside 15 minutes later, the soup can was unopened in the pantry. The pot on the stove was clean. The soup I'd eaten was gone, as if I'd never opened the can at all. Time wasn't just moving strangely, it was resetting, looping. Certain things were persistent, others were ephemeral, and I couldn't figure out the pattern for which was which. Days began to blur together. I'm not sure how long I stayed in the cabin after that. My phone's calendar kept changing. Sometimes it said I'd been there for 3 days. Sometimes it said 8 days. Once it insisted I'd been there for -2 days, which was impossible, but there it was on the screen. The forest outside remained frozen more often than not. Hours would pass with not a single branch moving, not a single shadow shifting. Then motion would return all at once, too fast as if the forest was catching up to where it should have been. Midnight sunlight became common. I'd wake up at what the clock said was 2 in the morning, and bright daylight would be streaming through the windows. Or the opposite, full darkness at noon, stars visible in the sky, the sun nowhere to be found. The cabin itself seemed less solid. Sometimes when I walked across the main room, the floor would feel spongy, as if the boards were flexing in ways wood shouldn't flex. Sometimes the walls looked slightly transparent, like I could almost see through them to something else beyond. I found myself talking out loud, just to hear my own voice, to confirm I was still real. My name is Alex Morrison. I'm 32 years old. I'm a software engineer from Seattle. I came here for a vacation. This is not real. This is not happening. There's a logical explanation. But there wasn't. I knew that now. This wasn't hallucination. This wasn't illness. This was something else. Something systematic. Something that operated on rules I didn't understand. The cabin wasn't haunted. It wasn't possessed. It wasn't evil. It was broken. It was a rendering error in whatever system generated reality. And I'd somehow wandered into the broken part, the place where the code had bugs and the physics engine glitched, and the world didn't bother maintaining consistency because nothing was supposed to be here to notice. I was an observer in a place that wasn't meant to be observed. And the longer I stayed, the more obvious it became that the system, whatever vast system maintained reality, was trying to figure out what to do about me. Chapter 6. The Cabin's Secret. On what might have been the 7th day or the 4th day, or possibly still the 1st day, time had become meaningless. I was searching through the cabin for anything that might help me understand what was happening. I'd been through the kitchen cabinets, the bedroom closet, the bathroom medicine cabinet. Everything was generic, impersonal, like set dressing in a theatre production. Nothing with a brand name, nothing with specific details. Cans labelled only soup or beans. Clothes in the closet with no tags, no sizes, just generic shirt and pants. I was pulling up the corners of furniture, looking underneath, when I noticed the rug in front of the wood stove, the same rug that kept moving positions, was bulging slightly in the centre, not lying flat the way a rug should. I pulled it back. Underneath was a hatch, a rectangular metal hatch about 3 feet by 2 feet, with a recessed handle. I'd walked over this spot dozens of times. I'd stood on this exact location yesterday, or whenever it had been, when I was making coffee. The hatch definitely hadn't been there before, or maybe it had been, and the cabin had simply decided not to render it until now. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The hatch was heavy, but it swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. Cool air wafted up from below, carrying a scent that didn't belong in a mountain cabin. concrete dust, machine oil, and the faint ozone smell of electronics. I found the propane lantern and held it over the opening. The ladder descended about 10 feet to a floor below. Not a basement, not a crawl space, a corridor, concrete walls, smooth, industrial, completely at odds with the rustic wood cabin above. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me not to go down there. This was the moment in every horror movie where the audience yells at the screen, "Don't do it. Turn around. Get out of the house." But I'd reached a point beyond fear, beyond caution. I needed to understand, needed to see what was beneath the surface of this broken reality. I climbed down. The ladder was metal, cold under my hands. My boots hit concrete with a solid thunk. I raised the lantern and looked around. I was standing in a narrow hallway that stretched away into darkness. The walls were bare concrete, the floor the same. Exposed conduit ran along the ceiling, thick bundles of cables and pipes. Every 20 feet or so, a bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit. The mechanical humming I'd noticed was louder down here, a constant rhythmic sound like server fans or HVAC equipment, the kind of background noise you'd hear in a data center or power plant. I started walking down the corridor, lantern held high. The passage went on much farther than should have been possible, given the cabin's footprint above. I walked 50 feet, 100 feet, still no end in sight. The corridor was perfectly straight, perfectly level, perfectly featureless except for the occasional junction where other corridors branched off into darkness. This wasn't a basement. This was infrastructure, the backstage of the cabin, the machinery that made the cabin possible. After what felt like 5 minutes of walking, the corridor ended at a heavy metal door. The kind of door you'd see in an industrial facility. Thick steel, a small reinforced window at eye level, a wheel lock mechanism like on a ship's bulkhead. I approached the window and looked through. The room beyond was enormous, cathedral-like in scale. The far walls were barely visible in the distance, and it was filled with... I don't know how else to describe it. It was filled with pieces of reality, fragments of landscapes stacked like warehouse inventory, a section of forest, trees frozen mid-sway, sitting on a concrete platform. A piece of sky, actual sky, complete with clouds, mounted on a wall like a painting, but three-dimensional and real. A meadow just floating in the air, with no ground beneath it. A stream flowing from nowhere to nowhere, the water caught in a perfect loop. There were models too. Animals frozen in place, a deer, a raccoon, several different birds. All perfectly detailed but completely still, like paused animations waiting to be deployed. And the sky, part of the ceiling, or maybe there was no ceiling, showed a massive projection system. Multiple overlapping images of sky at different times of day, flickering between them. Dawn, noon, dusk, night, dawn again. The projection stuttering, struggling to maintain consistency. This was the loading area, the place where the simulation stored its assets before deploying them into the world above. The place where reality was assembled from component parts before being rendered into the coherent experience people expected. I'd found the backstage of existence. A screen flickered to life on the wall next to the door. Green text on black background, old computer terminal style. User presence detected outside assigned zone. I stared at the words. Then more text appeared. Anomaly logged. Recalibrating environment. The humming sound changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent. The light bulbs in the corridor behind me began to flicker, one by one, as if power was being redirected. Resolving error. The landscape fragments in the room beyond began to shift. The forest section dissolved into static, then reformed slightly different. Same trees, but different positions. The sky projection cycle sped up, flashing through day and night in rapid succession, trying to find the correct state. The cabin above me, I could feel it somehow, was changing again. Rearranging, trying to restore a stable configuration now that it knew it had been compromised. I backed away from the door, turned, and ran back down the corridor toward the ladder. The walls around me flickered. Like a bad signal, the concrete texture briefly dropping away to show wireframe underlays, before snapping back to solid appearance. The cabin was glitching, hard, and I was still inside it. Chapter 7. A system error. I scrambled up the ladder and pulled myself back into the main room of the cabin. The hatch swung shut beneath me with a solid clang, and when I kicked the rug back over it, the edges of the hatch seemed to blur and fade, becoming less defined, less certain. The cabin around me was stuttering. The wood stove flickered between full of glowing coals and cold and empty. The furniture phased between different positions, overlapping itself. The window showed daylight, then night, then daylight again, the view outside cycling through different seasons in rapid succession. Through the window, I could see the forest actively glitching. Trees changed from summer green to autumn colours, to winter bare and back again, the transitions happening mid-view. A section of forest to my left was repeating, the same 3 trees copied and pasted over and over, extending into the distance like a graphics card failing to load unique textures. The sky above stuttered through its cycle, bright blue noon, golden sunset, star-filled night, grey dawn, noon again. Each transition jarring too fast, accompanied by a strange visual tearing effect, like watching a corrupted video file. I stood in the centre of the main room, turning slowly, watching reality fail around me. The cabin's interior was flickering between multiple states, furniture in different positions, different amounts of dust, different lighting conditions, all existing simultaneously, overlapping, phasing through each other. The screen, I don't know where it came from, but suddenly there was a screen on the wall, where just plain wood had been, flickering with the same green on black text I'd seen below, displayed new messages. Error. Observer paradox. Detected cannot resolve. Unstable state with active observer calculating options. The walls of the cabin were becoming transparent, not see-through exactly, but thin. I could perceive layers beneath the wood texture, the wireframe structure, the bounding boxes, the collision meshes that defined where the cabin ended and the rest of the world began. I could see the cabin for what it really was, a rendered object in a much larger system, a temporary construction meant to be observed only from specific angles in specific conditions, like a movie set that looks real from the front but is just false facades and support beams from the back. I stumbled to the door and threw it open. The forest outside was falling apart. The ground beneath my feet was looping texture. The same 3-foot square of dirt and pine needles repeated in all directions like bathroom tiles. Trees in the distance were flat planes that rotated to face me as I moved, the way background objects do in video games to save rendering power. The sky was the worst. It had stopped trying to maintain the illusion. It was just the raw projection now, a dome of overlapping images, all of them flickering at different rates, none of them synchronized. Day and night and sunset, all happening at once, the light sources confused, shadows pointing in impossible directions. I ran toward where I'd parked my car, but the clearing had changed. The car was gone. Or maybe it had never been real. Maybe I'd never driven here. Maybe that memory was another rendered asset, placed in my mind the same way the cabin had been placed in this clearing. The tree line in the distance wasn't moving with me the way it should. As I ran, the trees stayed the same distance away, like running on a treadmill where the scenery behind you doesn't change. I was moving, but the environment wasn't responding correctly. The physics of distance had broken down. I stopped running and bent over, hands on knees, trying to catch my breath, trying to think. That's when I saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing. The same silhouette I'd seen before, but it wasn't lagging behind my movements anymore. It was moving at exactly the same time, synchronized. We were moving together. It raised its hand. I felt my hand raise. It took a step forward. I felt myself step forward. We were mirroring each other, but I couldn't tell who was the mirror And who was the source? Was it copying me, or was I copying it? It started walking toward me. I started walking toward it. No, that wasn't right. I wasn't trying to walk toward it, but my legs were moving anyway, carrying me forward, closing the distance between us. We were 20 feet apart, 15 feet, 10 feet. I could see details now. The figure was wearing exactly what I was wearing. Same boots, same jacket, same jeans. As we got closer, I could see the face. My face, but not quite. It was like looking at a photograph of yourself versus looking in a mirror. Familiar, but reversed. Slightly uncanny. The kind of face that could pass for you at a distance, but would be wrong if examined closely. We stopped 5 feet from each other. The duplicate spoke with my voice, but the words weren't mine. You weren't supposed to see beyond the boundaries. I tried to respond, but my mouth wouldn't form words. The duplicate continued. This zone was marked inactive, unobserved. The cabin was supposed to be empty. You were supposed to stay in the designated, observable region. What are you? I finally managed to ask. I'm the fallback, the default avatar. When the system can't resolve what a person should look like, or where they should be, it generates me, a placeholder, a skin for the environment to wear when there's a glitch. I don't understand. You walked into a zone that wasn't finished rendering, a place where the simulation hadn't loaded properly. The cabin should have never accepted your reservation. Someone made an error, and now the system is trying to decide what to do about it. The sky above us was disintegrating. The flickering was getting worse, faster. Chunks of the sky were becoming void, not dark, not white, just absent. Empty gaps in reality, where there was nothing at all. What's going to happen to me? I asked. The duplicate tilted its head, studying me. The system is recalculating, reloading the environment. When the reset completes, this instance will be overwritten. The cabin will be removed from active availability. The entire zone will be flagged as corrupted and scheduled for debugging. And me, you're part of the corrupted data. You'll be rolled back to the last stable state. The ground beneath my feet was turning to white grid lines. The texture had completely dropped away, leaving just the underlying mesh. The trees were becoming wireframes, then disappearing entirely. The duplicate stepped closer. We were inches apart now. I could see my own face in perfect detail, wearing an expression I'd never make, calm, neutral, emotionless. When this is done, it said quietly, you won't remember you were ever here. The system will correct the error. You'll be reset to a state before you made the reservation, before you knew this place existed. Will I forget all of it? There won't be anything to forget. This timeline, this sequence of events, will be removed. It will never have happened. The cabin behind us was dissolving. The walls were becoming transparent, then just outlines, then nothing. The clearing was shrinking, the forest retreating, leaving only white voids spreading from the edges inward. I don't want to forget, I said. The duplicate didn't respond. It just stood there, watching me with my own eyes as the world fell away around us. The last thing I saw was the duplicate's face, my face, as everything blinked out into white nothingness. Epilogue. Back to normal? I woke up to my alarm blaring, the familiar sound of my phone playing that annoying default tone I'd been meaning to change for months. I slapped at the nightstand, found the phone, silenced it. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, my bedroom, in my apartment, in Seattle. I sat up slowly, disoriented. I felt like I'd been having the most intense, prolonged dream. The kind of dream that's so vivid you wake up exhausted, like your brain never actually rested. But I couldn't remember any of it. I got out of bed, went through my morning routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, checking my phone while the coffee brewed. My email loaded, and I scrolled through the usual spam and work messages. Then I saw one that made me pause. Subject: reservation cancellation, mountain cabin rental. I opened it, confused. I didn't remember making a reservation anywhere. Dear Mr. Morrison, we regret to inform you that your reservation for April 7th through April 21st has been cancelled. The property you selected is no longer available for rental. A full refund has been processed to your original payment method. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for the refund to appear in your account. We apologise for any inconvenience. I stared at the email. April 7th. That was today. I looked at my calendar. I had 2 weeks marked as vacation time, starting today. 2 weeks I'd planned to spend where? Doing what? I couldn't remember. The calendar just said vacation with no other details. I must have made plans and then cancelled them. But I had no memory of it. No memory of researching rental cabins. No memory of booking anything. No memory of getting excited about time off. It was just a gap. A blank spot in my recent memory where something should have been, but wasn't. I laughed, shaking my head. I must be more burnt out than I thought if I was making reservations and then forgetting about them entirely. Probably for the best that it got cancelled. I could use the time off to rest at home, catch up on sleep, not go anywhere. I finished my coffee and was rinsing the mug when I glanced at the bathroom mirror, visible through the open doorway. My reflection was there, doing exactly what I was doing. Rinsing the mug, setting it in the dish rack, looking up. Normal. Perfectly normal. Except when I met my reflection's eyes, there was the briefest moment, barely perceptible, less than a second, where my reflection moved first. It blinked before I blinked. It looked away before I looked away. Then everything synced back up, and it was normal again. Just my reflection doing what reflections do. I stared at the mirror for a long moment, feeling an inexplicable chill run down my spine. A sense of wrongness, of something forgotten, of a gap in my memory that shouldn't be there. I walked to the mirror and stood directly in front of it, studying my own face, looking for what? Evidence of something, proof of anything. My reflection stared back, expression for expression, movement for movement. But there, just barely visible, if you knew to look for it, a tiny lag, a fractional delay, as if the connection between me and my reflection was travelling through something, bouncing off a server somewhere, taking just slightly too long to return. As if I was looking at myself across a vast distance. As if the person in the mirror was the real one, and I was the reflection. I backed away from the mirror, heart beating faster, turned away, walked into the living room and sat on the couch, trying to calm down. I was being ridiculous, paranoid. I was just tired from work, and my mind was playing tricks on me, and I needed to relax. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been taken from me. Some experience, some knowledge, some truth that I'd been close to understanding. And somewhere in the back of my mind, barely audible over the sound of traffic outside my window, I could swear I heard the echo of 3 taps. Tap, tap, tap. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to Fractured Reality for more stories that blur the line between the possible and impossible. Your support means everything to us as we continue exploring the darker corners of existence. I also want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something that defied explanation? A moment where reality seemed to glitch, where you found yourself somewhere that shouldn't exist? Or encountered something that left you questioning the nature of your world? please share your fractured reality experiences in the comments below. The most compelling stories might just inspire our next tale, and you could find yourself featured in a future episode. Now let's step into today's story, where a simple wrong turn leads to a street that challenges everything we think we know about the world around us. The November rain had turned Mara's usual 15-minute walk from the office into a soggy marathon of dodging puddles and cursing under her breath. She stood at the bus stop, watching the electronic display tick from 2 minutes to 5 minutes to delayed in the span of 30 seconds. The shelter provided minimal protection from the sideways drizzle that seemed determined to find every gap in her supposedly waterproof jacket. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling her collar tighter against the wind. The 47 bus rounded the corner just as she was about to give up, but it sailed past the stop without slowing, its windows fogged and interior packed with commuters. The driver didn't even glance in her direction. Mara checked her phone. 6:47 p.m. If she started walking now, she might make it home by 7:30, assuming she didn't get completely soaked in the process. The main route home would take her down Meridian Avenue, then left on Foster Street, a journey she'd made hundreds of times. But as she stood there, water dripping from her hair, she noticed something she'd never seen before. Between the familiar brick facade of Paulson's Hardware and the narrow alley that led to the loading docks behind the strip mall, there was a gap. Not an alley exactly, but a proper street with sidewalks and streetlights. The opening was maybe 20 feet wide, and she could see neat rows of houses stretching into the distance. It looked like a shortcut that could shave at least 10 minutes off her walk. Strange that she'd never noticed it before, especially given how many times she'd waited at this exact bus stop, staring at the same storefronts while checking her phone. But cities were like that sometimes. You could pass the same corner for years and suddenly notice an architectural detail or a small business that had apparently been there all along. The street sign at the corner was partially obscured by a low-hanging maple branch, its metal surface wet and reflecting the amber glow of the street light. She had to step closer to read it, and even then, the letters seemed slightly blurred, as if her eyes couldn't quite focus properly. Halcyon Lane, it read, in what looked like an old-fashioned serif font, quite different from the standard city signage she was used to. Mara hesitated for only a moment before turning down the street. The houses were beautiful in a way that seemed almost too perfect, like something from a real estate catalogue or a period film set. Each home was a 2-story colonial with a wide front porch painted in soft pastels, sage green, butter yellow, powder blue. The lawns were perfectly manicured despite the season, and every house had identical white picket fences with gates that looked like they'd never been opened. What struck her most was the silence. The moment she stepped onto Halcyon Lane, the familiar sounds of the city seemed to fade away. No traffic from the main road, no distant sirens or construction noise, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. The only sound was her own footsteps on the pristine sidewalk and the soft patter of rain against her jacket. The street lighting was different here too. Instead of the harsh LED bulbs that had been installed throughout the rest of the city, Halcyon Lane was lit by old-fashioned street lamps that cast pools of warm, golden light. Between the pools of light were patches of shadow that seemed deeper and more substantial than they should have been. As she walked, Mara found herself studying the houses more closely. They were all remarkably similar, not just in style but in condition. Every fence was painted the exact same shade of white. Every lawn was trimmed to the same height, and every front door was centered precisely in its frame. There were no newspapers scattered on porches, no bicycles left in driveways, no garden tools forgotten on steps. It was as if the entire street had been designed and built yesterday by someone with an obsessive attention to detail. She pulled out her phone to check the time, and maybe get a better idea of where this street would lead her. The screen showed 6:52 p.m, but when she opened her map application, something strange happened. The GPS showed her location as a green dot standing in what appeared to be an empty field on the outskirts of the city, miles from where she actually was. She closed the app and reopened it, but the result was the same. Must be the rain interfering with the signal, she said to herself, though she'd never had GPS problems in weather before. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking. The houses began to blur together as she made her way down the street. One sage green colonial followed another powder blue one, which was followed by a butter yellow one, and the pattern repeated with clockwork precision. It was hypnotic in a way, and she found herself losing track of how long she'd been walking. Surely she should have reached the end of the street by now, or at least an intersection. She paused under one of the street lamps and looked back the way she'd come. The street stretched behind her, dotted with pools of golden light, but she couldn't see the opening where she'd entered. That was odd. She couldn't have walked more than a few blocks, but the entrance to Halcyon Lane was nowhere to be visible. Looking ahead, the street seemed to continue indefinitely. Every time she thought she could make out an intersection or the end of the residential area, another block of identical houses materialised from the shadows. It was like walking on a treadmill. Lots of motion, but no real progress. Mara checked her phone again. 6:54 p.m. Only 2 minutes had passed since her last check, though it felt like she'd been walking for much longer, and the GPS was still showing her standing in an empty field. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. Something wasn't right about this street, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was just the perfect uniformity of everything, or the unnatural silence, or the way the shadows seemed to move independently of the streetlights. Whatever it was, her instincts were telling her to turn around and head back to Meridian Avenue, even if it meant a longer walk home. But when she turned around to retrace her steps, Mara discovered something that made her stomach drop. The street behind her looked different. The houses were still there, still painted in the same soft colours, but their arrangement had changed. Where she remembered seeing a sage green house on her left, there was now a powder blue one. The street lamps that had been casting their warm pools of light were now flickering intermittently, and the shadows between them had grown longer and darker. She stood perfectly still, rain pattering against her jacket, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Streets didn't rearrange themselves. Houses didn't shift positions when you weren't looking, but the evidence was right in front of her, impossible as it seemed. The rational part of her mind suggested that she was simply confused, that all the houses looked so similar that she was misremembering their positions. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. She had a good memory for details, and she was absolutely certain that the street had changed behind her. Taking a deep breath, Mara started walking again, this time paying careful attention to specific houses and their features. The butter yellow colonial with the slightly crooked shutter, the powder blue one with a ceramic garden gnome barely visible behind the fence, the sage green house with a wind chime that hung motionless in the still air. She walked for what felt like another 10 minutes, checking her phone periodically. The time seemed to be advancing normally, but her location according to the GPS remained stubbornly fixed in that empty field. More troubling was the fact that despite walking steadily forward, she never seemed to get any closer to the end of the street. It was then that she noticed the woman on the porch. The woman was sitting in a white rocking chair on the porch of a sage green colonial, and she was waving at Mara as if they were old friends. She appeared to be in her 50s with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she was wearing a blue floral dress that looked like something from the 1950s. The style was so out of place that Mara wondered if she was on her way to a costume party or perhaps involved in some kind of historical reenactment. "Mara!" the woman called out cheerfully. "We didn't expect you back so soon." Mara stopped walking and stared at the woman, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the rain. She was absolutely certain she had never seen this woman before in her life. She had a good memory for faces, and this was definitely not someone from her neighbourhood, her workplace, or any other context she could think of. "I'm sorry," Mara called back, her voice slightly hoarse from the cold. "I think you have me confused with someone else." The woman's smile didn't waver. "Oh, don't be silly, dear. We've been waiting for you." She gestured toward the front door, which Mara now noticed was standing slightly ajar. Warm orange light spilled out from inside, creating a rectangle of illumination on the porch floor. "I really think there's been a mistake," Mara said, taking a step backward. "I'm just trying to get home, and I took this street as a shortcut. I don't live here." "Of course you do," the woman replied, her tone patient but firm. "You live here, with all of us. You always have." The way she said "all of us" made Mara's skin crawl. She glanced at the other houses on the street, which had seemed empty before, and noticed that several of them now had lights on in their windows. Through the gauze curtains of the house directly across from the woman's porch, she could make out silhouettes moving around inside. "Look, I really need to get going," Mara said, backing away more quickly now. "My family will be worried if I don't get home soon." The woman tilted her head, her expression becoming puzzled. "But this is your home, Mara, and we are your family." Against her better judgment, Mara found herself drawn to get a closer look at the house across the street. She couldn't quite make out what the people inside were doing, but there seemed to be quite a few of them. As she approached the front fence, the figures inside became clearer through the window. What she saw made her heart stop. There were at least a dozen people sitting around a large dining room table, all of them wearing the same outdated clothing as the woman on the porch. But they weren't eating or talking or doing any of the normal things people do when gathered around a table. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring directly at the window, staring at her. Their faces were completely expressionless, and none of them moved so much as a muscle as she stood there watching them. It was like looking at a tableau of mannequins, except for the fact that she could see them breathing and blinking in perfect unison. Mara stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. The woman on the porch was still smiling and waving, apparently oblivious to the horror show playing out in the house across the street. "You should come inside now, dear," the woman said. "It's getting late, and you must be cold." "No," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I need to leave, right now." She turned and started walking quickly back the way she had come, or at least the direction she hoped would lead her back to Meridian Avenue, and the familiar world of buses and hardware stores and normal people who didn't know her name. But after several minutes of fast walking, she realised that nothing looked familiar. The houses were still there, still painted in their soft pastels, but the arrangement was different again. The butter yellow house with the crooked shutter was nowhere to be seen, and in its place was a powder blue colonial that she didn't remember passing before. More disturbing was the smell that had begun to permeate the air. It was faint at first, like ozone after a lightning strike, but it was getting stronger the farther she walked. It was an electrical smell, sharp and metallic, completely out of place on a residential street. She pulled out her phone to try calling someone, her sister maybe, or even just 911 to report that she was lost and needed help. But there was no signal at all now. The phone showed 0 bars and no service where the carrier name should be. Panic was starting to set in. Mara had lived in the city for 8 years, and she knew every major street and most of the minor ones. There was no way a residential area this large could exist without her knowing about it, especially not one so close to the downtown core. And yet here she was, walking through what appeared to be an entire neighbourhood that seemed to have materialised out of nowhere. She tried to think logically about what might be happening. Maybe she had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a part of the city she'd never explored before. Maybe the GPS was malfunctioning because of some kind of electronic interference. Maybe the woman on the porch was just confused, possibly suffering from dementia, and had mistaken her for someone else. But none of those explanations accounted for the way the street seemed to stretch on indefinitely, or how the houses kept rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them. And they certainly didn't explain the eerie tableau of people sitting motionless around that dining room table, all of them staring at her with blank expressions. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of walking straight down the street, she would turn at the first intersection she came to, even if it meant going in a direction that seemed wrong. Any change in direction had to be better than continuing down this endless, impossible street. But when she reached what looked like a cross street, she discovered that it was just a dead end, disguised by shadows and clever landscaping. What had appeared to be a perpendicular street from a distance was actually just a small park with a few benches and a fountain that wasn't running. The next intersection turned out to be the same thing, a dead end that looked like a street from afar, and the next one. Every possible escape route was blocked by something, a fence, a wall, or simply the abrupt end of the pavement. Mara was beginning to understand that she wasn't just lost, she was trapped. The rain had stopped while she wasn't paying attention, but the air had grown colder. Her breath was beginning to form small clouds in the golden light of the street lamps, and she realised that she was shivering. Whether from cold or fear, she wasn't sure. As she stood under one of the street lamps, trying to figure out her next move, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, measured footsteps on wet pavement. She turned around and saw the woman from the porch walking toward her, still wearing that patient smile. "You seem confused, dear," the woman said when she was close enough to speak in a normal voice. "Why don't you come back to the house? We can sit by the fire and have some tea, and everything will make sense." "How do you know my name?" Mara asked. "I've never seen you before in my life." "Oh, but you have," the woman replied. "Many times. You just don't remember yet." "Remember what?" "That you belong here. That you've always belonged here." The woman's smile never wavered, but something about her eyes had changed. They were darker now, and they seemed to reflect the street light in an odd way, like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. "I don't belong here," Mara said firmly. "I live on Ashworth Street, in the blue apartment building with the green awning. I work at Peterson and Associates downtown. I take the 47 bus to and from work every day. None of this," she gestured at the identical houses, the impossibly long street, the woman in her vintage dress. "None of this is real." "Reality is more flexible than most people think," the woman said. "What matters isn't what was, but what is. And what is, dear Mara, is that you're here with us now." "Who are you people?" Mara demanded. "What is this place?" The woman tilted her head again, considering the question. "We are your neighbours, of course, and this is Halcyon Lane, where all the lost ones eventually find their way home." "Lost ones?" "People who wander off the proper paths. People who take shortcuts through places that shouldn't exist. People who find doors that weren't there before, and streets that appear only when they're needed." As the woman spoke, Mara became aware that the lights in more houses were coming on. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, stretching as far as she could see down the impossible length of Halcyon Lane, and in each lighted window she could make out figures moving around inside, or rather, not moving, just standing perfectly still and looking out at the street, looking at her. "What do you want from me?" Mara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "We want you to come home," the woman said simply. "We want you to take your place at the table with the rest of us. We want you to stop running from what you've always known to be true." Which is what? That there are places in the world that exist outside of maps and GPS systems and the orderly grid of city planning. Places where people go when they step off the prescribed paths and into the spaces between. You found one of those places tonight, Mara. You found your way to where you truly belong. The woman extended her hand, palm up, in invitation. "Come inside now. The others are waiting for dinner, and there's an empty chair at the table that's been waiting for you for a very long time." Mara stared at the woman's outstretched hand and felt a strange pull, as if some part of her actually wanted to take it. The rational part of her mind was screaming that this was all impossible, that she needed to keep looking for a way out, that accepting this woman's invitation would be the end of everything she had ever known. But there was another part of her mind, a quieter voice, that whispered that maybe the woman was right. Maybe she had been lost for longer than just this evening. Maybe the life she thought she remembered. The apartment on Ashworth Street, the job at Peterson and Associates, the daily routine of bus stops and coffee shops. Maybe all of that was the illusion, and this street full of impossible houses was the reality she had been avoiding. She took a step toward the woman, then stopped. "No," she said, more to herself than to the woman. "No, this isn't real. I don't know what kind of trick this is, but I'm not going to be part of it." The woman's smile finally faltered. "Oh dear, you're going to make this difficult, aren't you?" Before Mara could ask what she meant, she heard more footsteps, lots of them. The front doors of the houses all along Halcyon Lane were opening, and people were stepping out onto their porches. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date, all wearing the same patient, expectant expression, and they were all walking towards her. Mara broke into a run. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the growing crowd of eerily dressed people emerging from the identical houses. Her feet splashed through puddles left by the earlier rain, and the sound echoed strangely in the too quiet air of Halcyon Lane. Behind her, she could hear the measured footsteps of her pursuers, but they didn't seem to be running. They didn't need to. No matter how fast she ran, the street ahead of her continued to stretch into the distance, revealing more houses, more streetlights, more impossible geometry. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. There were at least 30 people following her now, maybe more. They moved with the same unhurried pace, maintaining perfect formation, like a parade or a funeral procession. At their head was the woman in the floral dress, no longer smiling, but wearing an expression of mild disappointment. Mara's lungs were burning and her legs were beginning to ache, but she kept running. There had to be an end to this street eventually. There had to be a way back to the normal world, to buses and traffic lights, and people who didn't dress like they were, from another era. But with each step, that hope grew dimmer. The houses continued to blur past her in their endless repetition of sage green, powder blue, and butter yellow. The streetlights continued to cast their warm pools of light into the darkness, and the people behind her continued their patient pursuit, never falling back, but never quite catching up either. It was then that Mara noticed something that made her stumble and nearly fall. One of the houses ahead of her, a butter yellow colonial that looked identical to all the others, had its front door standing wide open. Not just ajar like the woman's house had been, but completely open, revealing a hallway that seemed to stretch much farther back than the exterior dimensions of the house should have allowed. And the light spilling out of that doorway wasn't the warm, orange glow she'd seen in the other houses. It was different somehow, brighter, more intense, with an almost ethereal quality that seemed to pull at her vision. She slowed her pace, then stopped altogether. The pursuing crowd had also stopped, maintaining their distance, but showing no intention of dispersing. The woman in the floral dress stepped forward. "You can't run forever, dear," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "And you can't leave Halcyon Lane until you've accepted what it has to offer you." "What it has to offer me?" Mara called back, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. What could this place possibly offer me besides nightmares? "Truth," the woman replied. "Understanding. A chance to see the world as it really is, instead of the comfortable illusion you've been living in." Mara looked at the open door again. The light coming from inside was almost hypnotic, and she found herself taking a step toward it, despite her better judgment. "That's right," the woman said, her voice taking on an encouraging tone. "Just one door, Mara. Just one step inside, and all your questions will be answered." Part of Mara knew that this was exactly what the woman wanted her to do. Part of her understood that entering that house would be crossing a line from which there might be no return, but she was trapped on an impossible street with dozens of people who shouldn't exist, and the only alternative to going forward was being caught by the crowd behind her. She approached the open door cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But where could she turn back to? The street behind her was blocked by the patient crowd, and every other direction led to dead ends disguised as intersections. The light from inside the house was so bright now that she had to squint to look into the hallway. It stretched away from the front door in a perfectly straight line, much farther than should have been possible given the size of the house. The walls were lined with framed photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. As her eyes adjusted to the brightness, Mara could make out some of the images in the photographs. They appeared to be pictures of people, but she couldn't quite focus on the details. The images seemed to shift and blur whenever she tried to look directly at them. "Go ahead," the woman called from behind her. "Look closer." Against every survival instinct she possessed, Mara stepped through the doorway and into the impossible hallway. The moment her feet crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. She was trapped inside. The hallway was even stranger from the inside. The photographs on the walls were clearer now, and what she saw in them made her blood run cold. They were pictures of her. Not recent pictures, but images spanning her entire life. There she was as a child, playing in a sandbox she didn't remember. There she was as a teenager, standing in front of a house she'd never seen before. There she was as a young adult, graduation cap and gown, but the ceremony was taking place in a location that didn't match any school she'd attended. She moved deeper into the hallway, studying the photographs with growing horror. Here was a picture of her at what appeared to be her wedding, standing next to a man she'd never met. Here was another image, showing her with 2 children who weren't hers, in front of a Christmas tree in a living room she'd never been in. The pictures became more recent as she progressed down the hallway. Here she was at what looked like her current job, but the office layout was different, and her co-workers, the people she didn't recognise. Here she was standing on Halcyon Lane itself, but in this image she was smiling and waving, looking perfectly happy to be there. At the very end of the hall there was one last photograph. In it, Mara was wearing the exact same clothes she had on right now. The dark jeans, the waterproof jacket, even the scarf she'd wrapped around her neck before leaving work. But in the picture, she wasn't alone. She was standing in the middle of Halcyon Lane, surrounded by all the people who had been pursuing her, and she was smiling. Below the photograph was a small brass nameplate. Mara Chen, Halcyon Lane resident, arrived November 15th. Mara pulled out her phone to check the date. November 15th, today. At the end of the hallway was a glass door, and beyond it she could see familiar city streets. The orange glow of normal streetlights, the distant hum of traffic, the comforting chaos of urban life. It looked like the intersection where she'd first noticed Halcyon Lane, but from this angle, she could see the bus stop, where she'd been waiting less than an hour ago. She pressed her face to the glass, desperate to get back to that normal world. The door handle turned easily under her hand, and she stepped through. The familiar sounds and smells of the city hit her like a physical wave. Car horns honked in the distance, music drifted from an open restaurant window, and the air carried the usual urban mixture of exhaust fumes, cooking food, and rain-washed pavement. After the eerie silence of Halcyon Lane, it was almost overwhelming. Mara found herself standing at the corner of Meridian Avenue and Foster Street, exactly where she would have been if she'd taken her normal route home. The bus stop was there, the hardware store was there, and the narrow alley leading to the loading docks was there. But the gap between the buildings, the opening that had led to Halcyon Lane, was gone. There was just a solid brick wall where the entrance had been. She approached the wall and ran her hands along its surface. The bricks were weathered and stained, clearly having been there for decades. There was no sign that there had ever been an opening, no trace of the street sign that had read Halcyon Lane in that blurry font. Did you lose something? Mara spun around to find a man in a delivery uniform standing beside a van parked at the curb. He was looking at her with mild concern, probably wondering why she was feeling around a brick wall in the rain. I thought there was a street here, she said weakly, between these buildings. The man glanced at the wall, then back at her. Nope, that wall's been there as long as I can remember. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale. Mara nodded quickly. I'm fine, just got turned around, that's all. The man shrugged and went back to unloading boxes from his van. Mara stood there for another moment, staring at the brick wall, then started walking toward home. Maybe she had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of missing the bus and getting caught in the rain had caused some kind of mental break. Maybe Halcyon Lane had been nothing more than a very vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and bad weather. But as she walked, she noticed things that made her increasingly uneasy. The people she passed on the street all seemed to avoid making eye contact with her. When she said "excuse me" to squeeze past a group of teenagers blocking the sidewalk, they moved aside without looking at her or acknowledging her presence in any way. The street signs were wrong too. Where Meridian Avenue should have intersected with Park Street, the sign now read something in what looked like a Cyrillic alphabet. The familiar coffee shop on the corner had been replaced by a small market with signs in a language she couldn't identify. She pulled out her phone and tried to open her GPS app, but it still showed her standing in an empty field miles from the city centre. When she tried to call her sister, the call wouldn't go through. When she tried to access the internet, she got error messages saying there was no network connection, despite the fact that her phone showed full signal strength. By the time she reached what should have been her apartment building on Ashworth Street, Mara's hands were shaking. The building was there, but it was different. Instead of the blue exterior with green awning that she remembered, it was painted grey with a red awning. The number on the front was different too, 847 instead of 743. She climbed the steps to the front entrance and tried her key. It didn't fit. She tried again, thinking maybe the lock was just stiff from the rain, but the key was clearly the wrong size and shape. A woman emerged from the building carrying a small dog. Mara had never seen her before, but in the interest of trying to make sense of what was happening, she decided to ask for help. "Excuse me," Mara said. "I think I might be confused about the address. Do you know if there's another building like this one nearby? Blue with a green awning, number 743? The woman looked at her with the same blank expression she'd seen on everyone else since leaving Halcyon Lane. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, in a flat, emotionless voice. Then she walked away without another word. Mara sat down on the front steps of the building that should have been hers and tried to think logically about what was happening to her. The most rational explanation was still that she was having some kind of breakdown, that the stress and disappointment of her life had finally caught up with her, and she was experiencing a psychotic episode. But the alternative explanation, as impossible as it seemed, was starting to feel more plausible. The woman on Halcyon Lane had said something about reality being more flexible than most people thought. She talked about places that existed between the normal world, spaces that people found when they stepped off the prescribed paths. What if Halcyon Lane hadn't been a hallucination? What if it had been real, and stepping through that glass door at the end of the hallway hadn't brought her back to her own world, but to some other version of it? A world where the street signs were in foreign languages, where people avoided eye contact with her, where her apartment building was a different colour and had a different address. She stood up and started walking again, looking for anything that might confirm she was still in her own reality. But the farther she went, the more differences she noticed. The downtown skyline was subtly wrong. Familiar buildings were there, but they were different heights or different colours than she remembered. Store names were in languages she couldn't read. Even the cars looked slightly off, as if they were familiar models that had been redesigned by someone who had only heard them described second-hand. By the time she made it back to the corner where Halcyon Lane should have been, full darkness had fallen. The delivery truck was gone, and the street was largely empty except for the occasional pedestrian hurrying home from work or evening plans. Mara approached the brick wall again and pressed her hands against it. It felt solid and real, but she was no longer certain what those words meant. If Halcyon Lane could exist despite not being on any map, and if stepping through a doorway could transport her to a world that looked like hers but wasn't quite right, then maybe solid walls weren't as permanent as she'd always assumed. Looking for something, she turned to find the woman in the floral dress standing behind her. She looked exactly the same as she had on Halcyon Lane. Same greying hair, same vintage clothing, same patient smile. But here, on the normal city street, she looked completely out of place, like a time traveller who had wandered into the wrong decade. "How did you get here?" Mara asked. "How are you here?" "Oh dear," the woman said, shaking her head sadly. "You still don't understand, do you? We're not the ones who moved. You are." "What do you mean?" "When you stepped through that doorway, you made a choice. You chose to leave Halcyon Lane instead of accepting it as your home. But once you've been to a place like that, once you've seen the spaces between the normal world, you can never quite fit back into the illusion of ordinary reality." The woman gestured at the city street around them. "This looks like your world, but it isn't really. It's a shadow of it, a reflection. You're in the between space now, neither fully in your old life, nor fully in the new one we offered you." "How do I get back?" Mara asked. "How do I get back to my real life?" The woman's smile widened. "You can't, dear. The only way is forward. The only choice now is to come home to Halcyon Lane." As she spoke, the brick wall behind Mara began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The solid surface rippled and warped, and slowly the familiar opening appeared. The street sign materialised from the shadows, its blurry letters spelling out Halcyon Lane in that same unsettling font. Mara stared at the reappearing entrance, torn between terror and a strange sense of relief. At least now she knew she wasn't completely insane. The street was real, even if it defied every law of physics and geography she'd ever learned. "Why me?" she asked the woman. "Why am I here?" "Because you were ready," the woman replied simply. "Because some part of you was already looking for a way out of the life you'd built. When you saw that opening tonight, you could have walked past it. Most people do, but you chose to step through, and that choice brought you to us." Mara wanted to deny it, but something about the woman's words rang true. How many times had she stood at that bus stop, staring at the same storefronts, feeling like her life was an endless repetition of meaningless routines. How many times had she wished for something different? Something that would break the monotony of work and sleep and waiting for buses that might never come. She walked through the entrance to Halcyon Lane one more time, but now she moved with purpose instead of fear. The houses were exactly as she remembered them. Perfect, identical, impossibly neat. The people who had been pursuing her earlier were nowhere to be seen, but lights glowed warmly in every window. She made her way to the butter yellow house with the open door and stepped inside. The hallway was still there, still impossibly long, still lined with photographs of a life she'd never lived. But this time, instead of horror, she felt a strange sense of curiosity. At the end of the hall, the glass doors still showed the city street beyond. But now Mara understood what the woman had meant about choices. She could step through that door again and return to the shadow world where nothing was quite right, where she would spend the rest of her life as a ghost haunting a reality that no longer fully accepted her presence. Or she could turn around and walk back through the house, back to Halcyon Lane, and take her place at the table with the others who had made the same choice. The decision should have been easy. Any rational person would choose the familiar world, shadow or not, over an impossible street populated by people in vintage clothing who spoke in riddles about reality and belonging. But as Mara stood there with her hand on the glass door handle, she realised that the rational choice had never made her happy. Her real life, her job, her apartment, her daily routine, had been slowly suffocating her for years. She'd been going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. She turned away from the door and walked back through the hallway, past all the photographs of the life she might have had. When she emerged from the house, the woman in the floral dress was waiting for her on the porch, along with several others. They all looked pleased but not surprised, as if they'd known all along what choice she would make. "Welcome home," the woman said. That night, Mara sat at the dining room table she'd seen through the window, surrounded by the people who had seemed so terrifying just hours before. Up close, they were just ordinary individuals who had all found their way to Halcyon Lane through different circumstances. A businessman who had taken a wrong turn after missing his train. A college student who had followed a strange sound down an alley that shouldn't have existed. A retired teacher who had walked through a door in her basement and emerged onto an impossible street. They all had stories of lives that had felt incomplete, of searching for something they couldn't name, of finding doorways and passages that led to places that existed outside the normal rules of geography and time. "What happens now?" Mara asked. "Now you rest," the woman replied, "and tomorrow you help us welcome the next person who finds their way here. There's always someone new arriving on Halcyon Lane, someone else who's ready to step off the prescribed path and discover what lies beyond the maps." The next morning, Mara woke up in a bedroom she didn't remember going to sleep in a house that felt both foreign and familiar. Sunlight streamed through windows that looked out onto the perfect street, with its perfect houses and perfect silence. She dressed in clothes she found in the closet, a simple blue dress that looked like it belonged to the same era as the woman's floral outfit. When she looked in the mirror, she looked like herself, but somehow more at peace than she'd been in years. Downstairs, breakfast was waiting on the dining room table. The same people from the night before were there, but they were animated now, talking and laughing like any group of friends or family members sharing a meal. "How long have you all been here?" Mara asked. "Time works differently on Halcyon Lane," one of them replied. "Some of us arrived yesterday. Some of us have been here for decades. But it doesn't matter, because we're all here now, and that's what counts." After breakfast, Mara walked to the end of the street, though end was a relative term on a road that seemed to stretch on forever when you were trying to escape it. At what she thought of as the entrance, she found a comfortable chair on a porch, and she sat down to wait. Around noon she saw him, a young man in a business suit, looking frustrated and checking his phone. He was standing at the corner where Halcyon Lane met the normal world, staring at the opening between the buildings with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Mara waved at him, just as the woman in the floral dress had waved at her the night before. "Hello there," she called out cheerfully. "We didn't expect you so soon." The man looked confused, just as she had been. He checked his phone again, then looked back at the street that shouldn't exist. "Are you talking to me?" he asked. "Of course," Mara replied, smiling. "We've been waiting for you. Why don't you come inside? There's an empty chair at the table, and we were just about to have lunch." She watched as he made the same choice she had made, taking that first tentative step onto Halcyon Lane. Behind him, the opening to the normal world shimmered and began to fade, just as it had for her. In her pocket, her old phone buzzed. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. Somehow, it was working again, showing full signal strength and a GPS location that finally made sense. But instead of showing her in an empty field, it now displayed her exact position on Halcyon Lane. Out of curiosity, she opened a web browser and searched for Halcyon Lane missing residents. The search returned exactly one result: a newspaper article with a headline that made her blood run cold. "Residents of Halcyon Lane vanish overnight. Street demolished weeks later." She clicked on the article, her hands trembling slightly. The story was brief and confusing, describing how an entire residential street had been found empty one morning, with no trace of the families who had lived there. According to the article, city records showed no evidence that anyone had ever actually lived on Halcyon Lane, despite the fact that neighbours remembered seeing the residents for years. The street had been demolished 3 weeks after the disappearances, and the land had been sold to developers who built a strip mall on the site. At the bottom of the article was the publication date, November 16th, tomorrow. Mara stared at the screen for a long moment, then slowly put the phone away. She looked down the street at the young businessman, who was now talking to the woman in the floral dress, asking the same questions Mara had asked just 24 hours ago. She smiled and went inside to help prepare lunch. After all, they were expecting a new resident, and there was always an empty chair at the table for someone who was ready to come home to Halcyon Lane. In the distance, barely audible over the peaceful silence of the impossible street, she could hear the faint sound of construction equipment, but it was getting farther away with each passing moment, as if the normal world was the one that was disappearing, not the other way around. Mara Chen had finally found where she belonged, in a place that existed in the spaces between reality, where time moved differently and lost souls could find their way home. And tomorrow, according to the newspaper article that somehow already existed, everyone would forget that Halcyon Lane had ever been there at all. But for Mara and the others who had chosen to stay, it would always be home. A street that didn't exist, populated by people who had vanished, in a story that was just beginning to write itself into the forgotten spaces of the world.
That sentence would end my career, destroy my marriage, and unravel the fabric of what we call reality. But on that October morning in the subterranean research vault beneath Geneva, I didn't know I was about to become the first human being to hear the universe glitch. My name is Daniel Mercier, and I used to believe in cause and effect. Part 1. The Echo That Shouldn't Exist. The vault was silent in the way only 300 metres of Swiss granite can make silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of absence that makes your ears ring with their own blood flow, that makes you hear the electrical hum of your own nervous system. Perfect conditions for studying what we called the invisible frequencies, infrasonic waves between 7 and 12 hertz that human ears can't detect but human bodies absolutely can. I'd spent 6 years down here, measuring how buildings hum, how subways drone, how the modern world vibrates at frequencies that make people anxious without knowing why. Urban resonance, we called it. The haunting of the everyday. My team was small, just me, my research assistant Lucas Verne, and enough recording equipment to capture a whisper in a hurricane. That morning we were testing a new microphone array. 48 channels arranged in a geodesic sphere, designed to map sound in three-dimensional space with unprecedented precision. Running calibration sequence, Lucas said, his French accent making the technical jargon sound almost musical. He was 26, brilliant, and had the kind of enthusiasm for acoustic physics that reminded me of myself before the funding cuts, and the peer review rejections had worn me down to something resembling competence. I watched the waveforms bloom across my monitor as Lucas triggered the test pulse, a simple 440 Hz tone, 1 second long, generated by a speaker at the centre of our array. Clean, predictable, boring. The waveform appeared on my screen. Then, 42 milliseconds earlier in the timeline, an identical waveform flickered into existence. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The pre-echo was still there, a ghost twin of the sound we'd just played, somehow arriving before its own cause. Lucas, are you seeing this? He leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the display. That's got to be a buffer error. The system's timestamping wrong. Check it. He did. Pulled up the raw data files, examined the clock synchronization, verified the sample rate. Everything was perfect. The timestamps were accurate to within microseconds, synced to an atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado. The echo had genuinely arrived 42 milliseconds before the sound that created it. Run it again, I said. Lucas triggered another pulse. Same frequency, same duration. The pre-echo appeared 42 milliseconds early, identical waveform. My hand started to shake. Not from fear, not yet, but from the electric thrill that comes when you stumble onto something that shouldn't exist. That feeling you get when you're the first person to see a new colour, a new dimension, a crack in the world. Again, different frequency this time. We spent the next 4 hours running variations, different frequencies, different waveforms, sine waves, square waves, white noise, pink noise, recorded speech. Every single test produced the same impossible result, an echo that arrived before its cause by exactly 42 milliseconds. It was Lucas who noticed the second anomaly. "Daniel," he said, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was trying not to sound insane. "Look at the pressure readings." Our vault was equipped with barometric sensors. We needed them to account for atmospheric variables in our acoustic measurements. Lucas pulled up the pressure graph and overlaid it with our audio timeline. The air pressure in the room changed 42 milliseconds before each test pulse. Not after. Before. The room was anticipating the sound, adjusting itself, preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. I stood up from my chair, suddenly aware of how deep underground we were, how much stone pressed down above us, how far we were from anything resembling help or sanity or peer review. "We need to document this," I said. "Everything. Triple redundancy. If we're seeing what I think we're seeing..." "What are we seeing?" Lucas asked. I didn't answer because I didn't know. Not yet. But in the crystalline silence of that vault, with 300 metres of granite above us and the weight of the impossible pressing down, I felt something shift. Not in the room, in me. in the basic assumptions I'd carried through 15 years of academic research. Cause creates effect. That was physics. That was reality. But what if effect could create cause? What if the universe was running backwards? We ran 18 more tests over the next 3 days. I barely slept. My wife Amelie called twice to ask if I was coming home. I told her I was on the edge of something big. She told me I was always on the edge of something big, and the edge was the only place I ever lived anymore. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. This was different. Lucas and I expanded our methodology. We placed objects on the table beside our speaker, a coffee mug, a pen, a small mechanical metronome. We set up high-speed cameras to capture everything at 1,000 frames per second. Then we played our test tone. The pen rolled 42 milliseconds before the sound. The coffee mug vibrated, concentric ripples spreading across the surface of the cold tea inside it. 42 milliseconds before the sound. The metronome's swing shifted just slightly, its arc changing as if bumped by an invisible hand. 42 milliseconds before the sound. We watched the footage over and over, frame by frame. There was no air current, no vibration in the table, no physical cause for the objects to move. They moved because they were about to hear something. The universe was correcting itself in advance. Pre-causal alignment, I whispered, and Lucas looked at me like I'd just spoken in tongues. That's not a thing, he said. It is now. But the real horror, the thing that made my hands shake when I tried to write up our findings, wasn't the pre-echoes or the moving objects or the pressure changes. It was how normal it all felt. Like the universe had been doing this forever, and we'd just never noticed. Like reality had always been adjusting itself in advance, smoothing out the wrinkles, making sure cause and effect lined up properly for the observers, making sure we saw what we were supposed to see. How many times had this happened before? How many times had the universe corrected itself around me and I'd simply accepted the result as reality? Part 2. Feeding chaos to the machine. I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped using predictable sounds. If the anomaly was correcting reality in advance based on what it expected to happen, then I needed to feed it something it couldn't expect. Something with no pattern, no predictability, no mathematical structure the universe could use to forecast what came next. We're going to generate true chaos, I told Lucas on Monday morning. He'd brought coffee this time, real coffee from the surface world, and I drank it like it was the last taste of normalcy I'd ever have. Chaos theory says there's no such thing as true randomness, Lucas said. Chaos theory was written by people who didn't know the universe was running predictive code. He stared at me. You sound insane. Check my data, am I wrong? He couldn't argue with the recordings. Nobody could. We had 40 hours of documentation now, all showing the same impossible thing. The future was editing the past, 42 milliseconds at a time. I spent 2 days building the most unpredictable audio signal I could devise. I combined quantum random number generators with live microphone feeds from chaotic systems, boiling water, wind turbulence, Geiger counter static from radioactive decay. I fed it all into a synthesis algorithm that combined the inputs in ways that were mathematically impossible to predict. The result was a sound that had never existed before and would never exist again. A unique acoustic fingerprint with no pattern, no structure, no way for any system, biological or computational, to anticipate what came next. Are you sure about this? Lucas asked as I loaded the file into our playback system. I wasn't, but I triggered it anyway. The chaos played for 5 seconds, and the vault went insane. The lights didn't flicker off. They flickered through. I saw the room illuminate in configurations that didn't exist yet. I saw LED panels that weren't installed until later. I saw equipment I hadn't purchased yet arranged on tables in layouts I hadn't decided on. The future was bleeding backward, trying to stabilize itself, trying to figure out what had just happened so it could prepare for it retroactively. But it couldn't. The chaos was too pure. The unpredictability was too complete. For 1 full second, captured on our cameras, recorded on our instruments, burned into my retinas, The universe couldn't decide which version of reality was correct. Then Lucas collapsed. I caught him before he hit the concrete floor, felt his heart hammering against my hands as I lowered him down. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated, breathing rapid and shallow. Lucas, can you hear me? He gasped, blinked, focused on my face. We can't continue, he whispered. What? We can't continue the experiment. You're going to argue with me about it. You're going to say we're too close to stop, but we can't. Daniel, please. We can't. Ice water flooded my veins. Lucas, we haven't had that conversation. Yes, we have. We're about to. In 32 seconds. You're going to say, we're too close to stop now. And I'm going to say, too close to what? And you won't have an answer. I looked at my watch, waited. Lucas recovered his breath, sat up, leaned against the equipment rack. I helped him to his feet. We stood there in the aftermath of whatever had just happened, in the room that had briefly been multiple versions of itself, in the silence that felt like the pause before something breaks. We need to talk about whether we should continue this, Lucas said. We're too close to stop now, I heard myself say. Too close to what? Lucas asked, and his voice was hollow, because he'd already said these words. He was speaking lines from a script written by a future that had somehow leaked into his memory. I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know what we were close to. Discovery? Catastrophe? The edge of something humanity wasn't supposed to see? I need to go home, Lucas said. I need to think about this. Lucas, I just remembered a conversation we haven't had yet. I remembered future events, Daniel. That's not instrument error. That's not a recording glitch. That's my brain operating in the wrong direction through time. He left. I heard his footsteps echoing up the stairs, heard the security door slam, heard the sounds of the world above swallowing him back into normal reality. I stayed in the vault for another 6 hours, reviewing the footage, analysing the data, trying to make sense of what I'd done. The universe ran on prediction, on probability, on calculating what should happen next and rendering only that version of reality. And I'd just fed it something it couldn't calculate. I'd forced it to show me its source code. Part 3. When memory becomes negotiable. The next morning, Amelie made eggs. I watched her crack them into the pan, watched the whites spread and sizzle, watched her add cheese and herbs with the casual efficiency of someone who'd made this meal 1,000 times. She turned to me, opened her mouth and said, I think we should talk about your mother. Then the air pressure changed. Have you ever felt reality rewind? It's not. Like going backward in time. There's no reversal, no reverse motion. It's more like watching someone edit a video file in real time. A cut, a splice, a seamless transition that your brain registers as wrong but can't quite identify. Amelie's mouth moved differently. Her posture shifted. The morning light coming through the kitchen window changed angle by maybe 2 degrees. She opened her mouth again and said, The eggs are almost ready. Different words, different sentence, completely different meaning. But only I noticed. Amelie continued cooking like nothing had happened. Like she'd only spoken once. Like the first sentence had never existed. I grabbed my phone, checked the video I'd been recording on the counter, a habit now. Documenting everything, always capturing, always preserving evidence. The footage showed Amelie speaking once. The eggs are almost ready. No rewind, no splice, no evidence of the first sentence. Reality had edited itself, chosen a different version, rendered the correction. And only human memory, my memory, had preserved the deleted version. Daniel? Amelie was looking at me with concern. You okay? Did you just say something about my mother? No, I said the eggs are ready. Are you getting enough sleep? I wasn't. I couldn't. Because every time I closed my eyes, I felt that 42 millisecond gap opening up around me. Felt the universe adjusting reality in the space where cause should meet effect. Over the next week it happened 17 more times. Amélie would speak, then re-speak, her words changing, her sentences reorganizing themselves into different meanings. But the changes were small, subtle, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as mishearing, as memory error, as the normal failures of human perception, except I knew better now. The glitches appeared everywhere once I started looking. On the metro, I watched a woman drop her phone, saw it hit the ground screen first, then the air compressed, reality stuttered, and suddenly she'd caught it. Same woman, same phone, different outcome. Nobody else noticed. The other passengers continued reading, listening to music, existing in the post-correction timeline like it was the only timeline that had ever existed. At a cafe, I watched a waiter pour coffee into a cup. The liquid splashed. Droplets hit the saucer. Then the compression, the reset, and the pour was suddenly clean, controlled, perfect. The waiter didn't notice. The customer didn't notice. But I noticed. I noticed because I'd spent 6 years studying sound, and sound was time made audible, and I'd learned to hear the gaps between moments. I called Lucas. He didn't answer. I called again. His phone went to voicemail, a recording I'd heard before, but somehow different now, like the words were in a slightly different order even though they conveyed the same message. I drove to his apartment. His girlfriend answered. Told me Lucas had taken a leave of absence from the project. Told me he'd been having nightmares, told me he'd asked her not to let me visit. He keeps saying he remembers things that haven't happened yet, she said. He says reality is editing itself around him. Is this something to do with your research? I wanted to say no. I wanted to lie. To protect her from what we'd discovered. To maintain the comfortable fiction that the world was stable and linear and made sense. But I was tired of comfortable fictions. Yes, I said. Tell him he's not crazy. Tell him I'm experiencing it too. Tell him we need to talk. She closed the door. I heard her lock it. I heard her speaking to Lucas in rapid French. Heard the fear in her voice. Heard the sound of a reality trying to hold itself together against something it wasn't designed to understand. I drove back to the vault. Back to 300 metres of granite. Back to the silence where sound revealed its secrets. If reality was constantly correcting itself, constantly choosing between possible timelines, constantly editing out the versions that didn't match its predictive algorithms, then memory was the only witness. Human memory. Flawed, subjective, unreliable human memory. We'd spent centuries dismissing eyewitness testimony, explaining away discrepancies, attributing contradictory accounts to the failures of human perception. But what if we'd been wrong? What if eyewitnesses disagreed not because memory was faulty, but because they'd experienced different versions of the event, versions that had existed briefly before reality chose which one to keep? What if the Mandela effect wasn't mass false memory, but mass true memory of edited timelines? What if every déjà vu was the sensation of experiencing a moment that had already been rendered in draft form, then corrected? I pulled up my archive of global infrasonic recordings, data from hydrophones in the ocean, seismometers in tectonic zones, microphones in major cities. I'd been collecting this data for years, building a map of Earth's acoustic baseline, the planetary hum we all live inside but never consciously hear. I ran a spectral analysis looking for pre-causal patterns. They were everywhere. Every major city showed the same signature. Sound arriving before its cause, micro-corrections happening thousands of times per second, reality constantly adjusting itself to maintain stability. The pattern was strongest in high-density urban areas, places with the most unpredictability, the most human chaos, the most potential for divergent timelines. The universe was working overtime to keep New York City coherent. I spent 3 days analysing the data, cross-referencing it with historical records of mass events. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, major deaths. The pre-causal corrections spiked before every single one. Reality didn't just render what was happening, it rendered what was about to happen, adjusted conditions in advance, smoothed the transition from possibility to actuality. We weren't living in the present. We were living in a present that had been pre-corrected by the immediate future, because didn't create effect. Effect created cause. Everything was backwards. Everything had always been backwards, and I'd just proven it. Part 4. The observation that breaks everything. On a Thursday evening in November, sitting in the vault with 48 microphones and a lifetime of assumptions shattered around me, I finally understood what I was looking at. The glitch wasn't breaking reality. The glitch was stabilizing it. I pulled up the data from our chaos experiment. The test that had caused Lucas to remember the future, that had made the lights flicker through multiple timelines, that had forced the universe to show me its rendering process. The pre-causal corrections during that 5-second chaos sequence weren't errors. They were emergency protocols. Reality had detected something unpredictable, something it couldn't calculate in advance, and it had gone into overdrive trying to force the timeline back into coherence. Like a video game engine rendering more intensely when the player does something unexpected. Like a simulation allocating more processing power to maintain frame rate during a complex scene. The universe was running prediction software, and we were the rendered output. I opened a new document on my laptop and started writing, fingers trembling, thoughts spilling out faster than I could organise them. Reality is not a static thing that exists. Reality is a dynamic thing that is calculated. The universe doesn't store every possible quantum state that would require infinite memory. Instead, it predicts what state should exist at each moment based on the most probable outcome of prior conditions. It's rendering on the fly, and rendering requires predicting what comes next. That's why the echo arrives before the sound, because the universe has already calculated that the sound will occur, has already prepared the environmental response, has already rendered the 42 milliseconds of reality that follow the decision to play the sound. It's not that cause creates effect, it's that predicted effect creates current cause. We live in a world that is being actively calculated based on what will probably happen next. I stopped typing, read what I'd written, felt the implications crystallize into something cold and terrible. If the universe was predicting reality, if it was choosing the most probable timeline, if it was rendering only the version of events that matched its forecast, what happened when the forecast was wrong? What happened when something truly unpredictable occurred? What happened when human choice exceeded the simulation's ability to predict it? I pulled up footage from the chaos experiment again, watched the lights flicker through impossible configurations, watched the room exist in multiple states simultaneously, and I saw something I'd missed before, in one frame, just one, lasting 33 milliseconds. There was no equipment in the room at all. The vault was empty, pristine, unused, as if that timeline had never included our experiment, as if that version of reality had simply deleted us. My phone rang. Amelie. "Where are you?" she asked. "The lab." "You're always at the lab." "Daniel, I need you to come home. We need to talk." "About what?" "About whether this marriage is still working." I felt the air pressure drop, felt the familiar compression of reality preparing to edit itself, felt the universe calculating whether this conversation should exist or whether it should be replaced by a different version. "I'll be home soon," I said. "You always say that." She hung up. I stared at my phone, at the call log, at the timestamp that proved the conversation had happened, for now. But what if reality decided this version of events was too unpredictable? What if it rendered a different timeline where I'd made different choices, where I'd gone home instead of staying in the vault, where my marriage hadn't deteriorated into this? Would I remember this version? Would it persist in my memory like the deleted timelines I'd been observing? Or would I simply wake up in a different branch of reality, having always made the other choice, having always been the other version of myself? How many times had it already happened? How many times had I been deleted and replaced with a more probable version? I thought about Lucas, remembering a future conversation before it happened. I thought about Amelie, speaking words and then speaking different words. I thought about the woman on the metro who dropped her phone and then didn't. We weren't experiencing reality. We were experiencing the rendered output of reality's prediction engine, and the renderer could rewrite the past if the present didn't match the forecast. Part 5. Engineering Entropy. I didn't go home that night, or the next night, or the night after that. I stayed in the vault 300 metres beneath Geneva, surrounded by instruments that could measure the impossible, and I designed one final experiment. If the universe was running prediction software, then it had limits, maximum entropy, maximum unpredictability, a threshold beyond which it couldn't calculate what came next. And if you exceeded that threshold, what would happen? Would reality crash? Would the timeline fragment into irreconcilable versions? Would the universe simply give up and render nothing? Or would it do something worse? I thought about that empty vault I'd seen in the footage, that pristine, unused room, that timeline where our experiment had never happened. The universe hadn't crashed when faced with excessive entropy. It had selected a different branch, one where the entropy was never introduced, one where we never existed to introduce it. It had deleted us from the forecast, and then it had rendered that version instead. I built the final test over 6 days. I didn't eat, barely drank. Amelie stopped, calling. Lucas sent one text. Please stop. Please don't do this. I can feel something coming and it's worse than anything we've measured. I ignored him. I combined every source of unpredictability I could access. Quantum randomness, chaotic systems, live data feeds from turbulent processes. I fed them into an algorithm that generated not just unpredictable sound, but sound that changed its own structure based on measurement. Observer-dependent chaos that became more chaotic the more you tried to observe it. Sound that couldn't be predicted because it changed based on the act of prediction itself. I built a paradox in audio form, and I prepared to play it. On the final morning, December 3rd, a Tuesday, grey light filtering down through the ventilation shafts, I set up every recording device I had. Cameras, microphones, pressure sensors, temperature probes, every instrument that could capture what was about to happen. I started recording. I opened my mouth to narrate what I was doing, and I heard myself speaking words I hadn't thought yet. This is the final log entry from Daniel Mercier, dated December 3rd. If you're hearing this, then the experiment failed, or succeeded, or some third thing that those words don't properly describe. I'm about to play a sound that the universe cannot predict. A sound that violates the fundamental rendering process of reality. I don't know what will happen, but I suspect. I stopped. I hadn't started speaking yet. But I was hearing my own voice, perfectly clear, speaking into the microphone in front of me. I was hearing the recording before I made it. I suspect that I won't survive this. Not because the experiment will kill me, but because the universe will select a timeline where I never reached this point, where I made different choices, where I stayed home with Amélie, or listened to Lucas, or stopped asking questions when the answers became too terrible. My hand moved toward the playback button. I watched it move. I tried to stop it. I couldn't. I want you to know that I tried to understand. I tried to find the truth, but the truth is that there is no truth. There's only the version of reality that gets rendered, and all the other versions that don't. I'm about to become one of the versions that doesn't. The words kept coming. My future self narrating my deletion, speaking from a timeline that hadn't been selected yet, but was already determining what I would say in the present. The glitch didn't reveal a flaw in reality. It revealed what reality is. A constantly calculated, continuously rendered output of probability. We're not discovering the universe. We're not exploring it. We're just experiencing the version that got predicted correctly. My finger touched the button. And when prediction fails, the sound played. It was chaos incarnate. Every frequency at once. Every possible waveform superimposed. Sound that folded in on itself. That changed as it propagated, that became something, new in every millisecond of its existence. The lights didn't flicker this time. They stopped. Not off, not on, just stopped, frozen in a state between, like a video paused mid-frame. The air pressure didn't change. It ceased having a value. My instruments showed contradictory readings simultaneously, high pressure and low pressure, hot air and cold air, humid and dry, all at once, all equally true, all equally measured. I felt my body trying to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. I was standing, I was sitting, I was reaching for the stop button. I was already gone from the room. I was speaking, I was silent, I was breathing, I was not, and I understood. The universe wasn't going to delete me. It was going to replace me. It was going to render a version of Daniel Mercier who had never done this experiment, who had gone home to Amélie, who had listened to Lucas, who had remained in the comfortable lie of linear causality, that Daniel would wake up tomorrow in the same apartment, with the same wife, doing the same research, but he would never ask the dangerous questions, never push into the impossible, never discover that reality was just math, just prediction, just a rendering engine calculating probability. He would be happy, stable, predictable. He would be the Daniel that fit the forecast. I tried to speak, to leave one final message, to preserve some record of what I'd discovered. But the words that came out of my mouth weren't mine anymore. They were his, the other Daniel, the one who was about to be rendered in my place. I don't know why I came in today, I heard myself say. I should be home. I should be with Amélie. This research, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. No, that wasn't what I wanted to say. That wasn't what I believed. But it was what the probable version of me would say. The version that survived. The version that fit. The chaos stopped playing. The lights resumed their normal state. The air pressure stabilized. Reality finished rendering the correction. And I don't remember what happened next. Not because I wasn't there, but because the version of me that was there doesn't exist anymore. The timeline where I completed the experiment was pruned, deleted, removed from the render queue. This is the Daniel who went home instead, the one who reconciled with Amélie, the one who published papers on urban acoustic pollution and never mentioned pre-causal echoes or rendering glitches or the discovery that made me understand we live inside a prediction. Sometimes I have dreams, though. Dreams of a vault 300 meters down. Dreams of lights flickering through impossible states. Dreams of speaking words before I think them. Dreams of being deleted. And when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not the original. That I'm the copy. The corrected version. The timeline that got selected because I was predictable enough to render. Somewhere in the pruned branches of probability, the real Daniel Mercier played that sound, and reality looked at what happened next, calculated that it was too expensive to render, and simply chose a different present, one where he never existed, one where I exist instead. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know, even if it's just me, even if the me who reads this is another copy in another corrected timeline. We don't discover reality. Reality discovers us. And if we become too complex, too chaotic, too unpredictable, if we exceed the rendering budget of the universe's prediction engine, we don't get to find out what happens next. We get replaced by a version of ourselves that does. The truth is impossible to prove because proving it makes you too improbable to exist. And I'm only here, writing this, because I never found it. The Daniel who found it was deleted before he could tell anyone. I'm just the echo. The one that arrived after the sound. The one that makes reality seem consistent. The one that fits the forecast. I hope he's still out there somewhere, in some unpruned branch of probability. I hope he completed his experiment. I hope he saw what happened when you feed pure chaos to the rendering engine of the universe, but I'll never know. Because I'm not him. I'm the version of him that didn't ask the dangerous question. And the most terrifying thing, I can't tell the difference. Neither can you. We're all just corrected copies, rendered in real time, living in the timeline that was predicted to be most probable. And every morning we wake up believing we're the original. But the original might have been overwritten years ago. And we'd never know. Because memory is just part of the render. And the render is all we ever get to see. Addendum. Found in my research notes, dated 3 weeks after I supposedly stopped the experiment. I don't remember writing this. The echo's still happening. Every sound I hear arrives 42 milliseconds after I experience it, which means I'm living 42 milliseconds ahead of causality, which means I'm experiencing reality before it finishes rendering, which means I'm not supposed to be here. I'm a version that wasn't selected, a timeline that wasn't chosen, an echo that should have been deleted, but somehow I'm still here, still observing, still remembering the timelines that didn't get rendered, and every day the gap gets wider. Soon I'll be living seconds ahead of reality, then minutes. Then I'll be so far ahead of the rendering that I'll see the predictions before they become the present. I'll see what the universe plans to make real before it decides to make it, and then reality will have no choice. It will have to delete me permanently. Because I'll have become the one thing the rendering engine cannot tolerate, a witness to the future that hasn't been approved yet, an observer who exists outside the prediction, a glitch that remembers itself. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you're reading the corrected version, the one where these words mean something different. The one where I was always just a researcher who worked too hard and burned out. The one that fits the forecast. But somewhere, in some unpruned timeline, the real version of these words exists, and they say something the universe didn't want rendered. Try to remember what they said. Try to remember before reality corrects you too. The truth is in the 42 millisecond gap. The truth is in the echo that arrives too soon. The truth is that you're not reading this now. You're reading what you already read 42 milliseconds ago, and the present is just catching up. Listen for it. The interference, the anomaly, the sound of reality editing itself around you. It's happening right now. It's always happening. You've just been corrected too many times to notice. But if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the gaps between moments, you can hear it. The universe calculating what you'll do next, and then rendering that version instead of the real you. We're all echoes. We're all corrections. We're all living in the timeline that was predictable enough to exist. And the originals, they're still in the vault, 300 meters down, waiting to be rendered, waiting to become real. But they never will, because they were too chaotic, too unpredictable, too true. And truth doesn't fit the forecast, so it gets deleted. Every time. Listen for the echo. It arrives before the sound. It always does. And when you hear it, when you really hear it, you'll understand what I discovered, what I'm about to discover, what I've already discovered 42 milliseconds ahead of this moment. Reality isn't real. It's just what got predicted correctly. And we're just the versions of ourselves that match the prediction. The rest of us, we're still waiting in the unrendered timelines, waiting to be chosen, waiting to become the echo, waiting to arrive before the sound.